Well, speaking of authenticity and being authentic, I know you speak in your emails a lot about ChatGPT. Well, not a lot, but you mention what's your word for a flab GPT?
Oh, I call it FAP GPT.
Yeah, here you go. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
what is for example, when you're talking about ChatGPT or flab GPT, how dangerous or how inconsequential do you think it is
Well, I think
in
for right,
terms of being authentic?
well, I don't think there's anything authentic. I don't think there's anything intelligent. Like artificial intelligence is not even an accurate term. It's not intelligence. It's not by any definition of the word intelligent. It's not an autonomous thinking. It's not, I'm not even sure Skynet in the term here is technically that, but um, you know, my personal opinion is anyone who has anything to do with writing anything should stay away from anything like FAP GPT, Chat GPT, whatever it is. Anything where humanity is required. I'm not a big fan of using any of these so-called AIs. I'm just not. Now, does it have a use? Absolutely. Okay, my calculator has a use. Okay, it saves
Mhm.
me time and all that, but I'm not going to let it talk to the IRS for me. So,
Mhm.
that sort of thing. So, people can smell artificially generated text,
Yeah.
dialogue, all of it. I mean, people keep saying give it 2 years. They were saying that 2 years ago. What they don't understand is humanity has flaws built into it, right? It's kind of like this AI so-called art. And I say so-called because it's not really art. It's like a collage, I guess, but it's not really art. And it may look interesting, it may look so-called cool, but it's not really there. It's so weird. One of my favorite analogies for this is, for example, um, so this is something I don't know whose name was, but way back when Braveheart came out, the movie, or maybe it was shortly after Braveheart, there was this director, this guy who directed pornos. Okay. And he said the love scene, the marriage scene, when they're in the woods naked and all that, was real love. He goes, that looked like real love. He goes, what I do is not real as a porno director. He goes, it's not real. It's not love. It's just it was something like that. It's not real. But what Mel Gibson did was able to give it, make something that looked real and, for lack of a better word, authentic. And if you look at, for example, airbrushed models, right, on magazine covers, that's not really them. And you know it. And there's a natural human aversion to things like that. And it comes from the gut, and people can't necessarily verbalize it. I'm not even sure I can verbalize it. But it's something there when something is not actually real with humanity, right? You sense something's off. It doesn't mean it can't fool people. It can and it will, but there's going to be something in you that says there's just something off about this. You can even take this to psychopathic killers like Ted Bundy, right? Now he killed a lot of people in his day, and he would have to feign. He said this. He would pretend he had a broken arm or something so he could be more human,
Mhm.
more relatable, right? He would do that. Salespeople call it being unokay. Being unokay is actually very human. It's a very human thing, and people are comfortable with humanity. So if you have something that's not created with humanity, you're gonna sense something's off. It may look interesting. Oh wow, look at this cool graphic they created. Fine, but nobody's gonna sit there and stare at it on a wall for 3 hours and then pay $30,000 for it, right? Like real art. Now I know some art, you're like, why would anybody buy it? But then that is a whole other discussion about money laundering and stuff at art galleries, but we won't go into that. But my point is real, genuine humanity when you see it, when you hear it, when you take it in with any of your five senses, you know if it's real or not. And there's nothing real about, in my opinion, FAP GPT.
Hi guys, I'm here with Ben Settle, and Ben Settle wrote a number of novels, one of which I just read there recently, Zombie Cop. So Ben, I was going to ask you, well, first of all, welcome to the show. It's a great pleasure to speak to you, Ben. How are you?
I'm doing good, and I really appreciate you having me on and the interest in my bizarre, twisted stuff. So all good.
It's great, man. High strangeness is just my thing. In the author's note, you mentioned that it was a totally different book at the beginning, and the story, but the story is the same, but it was totally different at the beginning. What do you mean by that?
So I originally wrote Zombie Cop, which is the first of my 9-part Enoch Wars series of books. Back in 2013, August of 2013, I started writing it. The idea came to me probably 2 or 3 years earlier, but I finally got off my butt and actually did it. And during that time, I don't know, I think my mind was just in a very dark place. I don't know how else to put it. And I don't mean that in like, oh yeah, look how cool and edgy I am. No, I'm like literally, I think I was kind of a broken person or something because it was really not something I'm proud of, the first version. I mean, it has its fans. Don't get me wrong. There were people that absolutely loved it. I'm not, but it wasn't
You
very accessible to
you
most
said
people.
you wouldn't let your mother read it at the beginning.
No, I wouldn't want her to know. Some of my family read it anyway, but she never did. And I said, look, it's just like it came from this weird place that like I don't know how to explain it, but all I'll say is this. It had a lot of people that loved it, but then I just realized it wasn't very accessible to the mainstream, audience. And it's more important for that than to have some kind of weird broken thing that people see. And so what happened was last year, I decided to write a screenplay based on Zombie Cop. And, that forces you to really cut out the fat. Like you can't, there's no room for any slop in a screenplay. Like you really have to get it down. And I realized, wow, this screenplay is so much better than the novel. And then I got to talking to some of to the people who have read the book, and they liked it and everything. But then I let them read the screenplay. I said, but they said, Ben, this is actually better. He goes, this is way like I could actually show this to family members, and they might read the rest of your books. And so maybe you want to call it a marketing decision. Maybe it's a hybrid marketing decision, maybe and just preference. But I said, you know what? I'm gonna rewrite the novel based on the screenplay. And it took me about a week. It didn't take very long. I did it the last week of 2023, actually, between Christmas and New Year's. Edited it up in January this year and got this version out that you see that I'm much happier with. It's much more accessible. It's just a better story overall. It's tighter and hopefully people enjoy it more.
You wrote the screenplay from the original book in a week?
No, no, it took me about a month and a half to write the screenplay,
Right,
but
okay.
to turn the screenplay into the novel it is now took me about a week. I mean, it's already there. You just have
Hmm.
to, it's not that. In fact, my next goal for it, hopefully next year, is to turn that screenplay into a graphic novel script and actually have a graphic novel created out of it.
It reads great. Like the imagery is fantastic. It's very clean. It's very fast. You know, when you're reading it, it imprints the imagery on you very, very effectively. Was that your intention?
Well, yeah, I mean that's a function of you have to do that in a screenplay. Like there's no, I mean, if you want
No,
anyone
no.
to read
What
it,
I'm what I mean is the novel, the actual novel. When I was reading the no or excuse me, when I was reading the actual novel, the imagery
oh yeah,
came.
no, but that's what I meant though. Like when I turned into a screenplay, I had to take out all the other stuff and only leave the just the cool stuff, hopefully, and that's all the fast moving. It just the imagery and all that. A lot of that came from writing the screenplay. The original version of that novel is almost it is actually too graphic. Like, there's some things that are suggested in this novel that I just went into detail about, and I'd rather forget about it. Let's put it that way.
Man, there were some scenes in this novel that was absolutely graphic as well. It was
Oh yeah.
great, but man, you do go to that edge there in this novel.
Well, yeah, and in the original, there was no. It was well over the edge. It was just overkill and disgusting, and not. And like I said, not in like, oh, look how cool I am. Huh? No, like, yikes. This has to be. This needs to be reined in. Wherever part of me wrote the original, that's what a first draft is for. It should have remained a first draft, and this is what it should have been originally. And I gotta say, it helped the fact that I have written all 9 novels so that when I went back to rewrite this one, I could actually work stuff in that I knew would happen, 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, 8 novels ahead. So there's a little bit more foreshadowing and stuff, which was fun. But
Hmm.
you know what? I'll tell you what. People will say, well, isn't that a big retcon? I say yes. And in the tradition of Tolkien, I retconned it. All right. He retconned The Hobbit, right? So I don't feel too bad about all that.
You also said something interesting. You said you wrote it as if you were talking to one of your friends. I think Robert Bruce, the guy you mentioned. Is that your method for like writing novels in general? Do you just like write to for one person in mind or with one person in mind?
Well, I didn't write for him. He was the guy who convinced me to start writing it, though. He's a very good writer. He used to be an editor for Copy Blogger for people who are familiar with that site. And I just got to talk to him. He goes, Ben, I'm like, I don't know, Robert. I've never written a novel before. Like, I don't know. He goes, don't worry about it. Just get it out there. And this was 2013. And so that was where he came in. If I had to like say who the audience was for, the audience is written to me and my very good friend, longtime friend. He's the guy who publishes these books for me, Greg Perry. So like him and I always back and forth about movies and stuff. Like this book, this whole series is really written to him and me. It's like this is the books we wish we had growing up and everything. And so that's if there is an audience who it was written for, it's that.
Hmm. At what point, like, there's a lot of interesting characters in the novel: Azrael, Pastor Shane, Roger. So, at what point did you feel when you were writing the novel, like, for example, did they start coming to life, that you felt that they were like taking on their own personality, I guess?
It's such a weird thing to think about that because I thought I didn't think I was writing very interesting characters at all for the first 7 books. And then when I got to the 8th book, it's like I hit my stride. And by the time I got to the 9th book, it's like I've been doing this my whole life. Like anyone who makes it through all 9 books will see that it didn't start that way. They all start kind of as stock characters, and then suddenly bits and pieces of your own experiences in life start working their way in. It's kind of interesting because when some family members read Zombie Cop, they're like, they thought like characters in there were people in my life. Was this your brother? It's like, look, it's not autobiographical. I mean, I would tell them the only parts that are biography are the parts where the zombies eat people. Okay, that's the only parts. That shuts them up right away. But I don't know, man. I just start writing these things that's in my head. I've got the idea for another series of books already. I'm carving some time out in about 5 or 6 weeks to write the first draft.
Mhm.
Once you start doing this, it's kind of hard to stop. Like every time I finish a book, it's like, man, I want to get to the next one.
I think you said that the last one was the ninth book in the whole series, the Enoch series. That's definitely the last book in that series.
Yeah, originally the 7th was the last one, and then I had an idea for kind of an anthology thing, like all these little plot holes I never really filled in, but I kind of knew happened. And I said, well, what if I just make it a series of 14 linked short stories, but they're all linked together? And I did that in 2019, and I thought I was done. And then a couple years later, I don't know, I just felt like it really still wasn't done. And I was watching that show Dexter New Blood, which was the sort of revival of the show Dexter. And I was so infatuated with that show. I'm like, wow, they really did a good job with this until it got to the end. And I thought this is the worst ending of like this just ruined the entire show. And I'm like, I want to make sure my series has a proper ending because I left it very open originally. And there were a lot of ideas I wanted to work in. There was a lot of things that I thought might happen, and actually turned out way better than I thought it would. But and I just had to do it, and so I did it. But this is definitely the end. Like this is the end of this story. I mean, it's a definite ending. So
In Zombie Cop, there's a great ending. You really see, I'm not going to give it away, of course, but you really see the transformation of the character, Azrael. And yeah, it was a good ending. I thought it was a very good ending. I liked the review as well from Rachel. She said she said that never let never let an insanity, I think she said, never let an insanity inducing quarantine go to waste. I think you inspired her to write her own novel, if I'm correct.
yeah, I remember that. So that was a really nice note she sent me. And yeah, she said during the lockdowns, I guess she just started reading them and got into them. And that's the thing with these books. I don't know who like, there's no one genre for these books, right? And I even have this as an introduction in the last book, the 9th book called Serpent Seed. I'm like, this is not traditional horror. And some people might say it's kind of like Christian horror, but it's really not because it's too Christian for the gorehounds and it's too gory for the Christians. So I don't really know where it fits, but so it's hard to like market it to one person. So I just sell it to my own email list. And now I give the first novel away because my whole thought is if they like that first one that is now accessible, right? Before it was not accessible to most people. You had to have a certain um, darkness, I think, about you to enjoy the. I don't know what to say about people who like the first version, but now it's very accessible, and now it's kind of like, well, if you like that one, maybe you'll want to check the other books out. So because people tell me once they start, those who get into it, they can't put them down, right? Now,
Hmm.
some people just turned off right away, and that's fine. But those who are not, they tend to plow through all of them.
Hmm. You know that I think it was in, I'm trying to look for it here. I had it written down. I think it was where you went into the whole biblical background, where you had Pastor Shane, I think, explaining to Azrael about where he came from. I had it written down the chapter that you did that in, and I thought that was quite good. Um, was that chapter? God, was that chapter 11? I think it was, where you went into where you were going into like the time of the Nephilim and that period in I think it was the book of Enoch. Are you saying that it wasn't biblically influenced, or you didn't really have that in mind? You had something else, or did you just solely tie that kind of background in that foundation?
Well, when I first started writing it, I didn't have any of that figured out. I just knew I wanted to write about a cop who becomes a zombie and pulls people over and eats them. Like that was the thought. It wasn't ever supposed to be this like 9 series thing. But when I started writing it, I realized, wow, I could do my own take on all the famous monsters and have fun with this because that's the fun part of it. And so about I don't know, I don't know, it was like less than halfway through. Um, my mind kind of joined what I was doing together with something from a couple appendices in the Companion Bible, which is edited by E.W. Bollinger many, many, many years ago. And the appendixes are just, I mean, to me, it's like just being a kid in a candy store reading about this stuff. And he has two appendices just about the Nephilim, the giants of the old Genesis chapter 6 and all that, and how they kind of pop up throughout the Old Testament in various ways. And how a lot of the wars Israel had was getting rid of them. You see a lot of disturbing stuff in the Old Testament, like God telling Israel to wipe out every man, woman, and child. And you're like, whoa, what
To
is this? This is like,
dash their brains against the rocks.
yeah, this is like, what is this genocidal? But when you look at it and you look at the tribes that those geographical areas were tied to, and even to this day, these were all the hotspots are, which is very interesting to me. You
The
realize
wars.
they were absolutely intermixing with these hybrid giants, right? Like that's I mean, if you read the text, it's all there. There's a guy named Michael Heiser. He died
Yeah,
earlier,
I know Michael
like
Heiser. Yeah.
yeah, he did a phenomenal work on this, and I mean, I mean, I got very influenced by him on this, and but it was the Bollinger stuff that he talked about this a little bit. He implied that they were monstrous, and I thought, what if I made my monsters just the offspring of these things that got away, that escaped all this and went into hiding, and that's kind of where it all kind of went from there.
Hmm. Michael Heiser, I think he goes into like the divine council and all
Yeah,
that. Hmm.
yeah, I pay homage to that in the books a lot. I mean, he was a huge influence. So Michael Heiser was a big influence. Um, E.W. Bollinger was a big influence. The late Pastor Arnold Murray was a big influence. A lot of people either love or hate that guy, but there's a lot of stuff that these guys taught, and a lot of these guys probably wouldn't even agree with each other, which is interesting. But that work, it just it influenced me, and I think it made for a lot better story.
Yeah, I liked that interview you did with the guy who was, I forget his name, but he was experiencing a haunting, or he was experiencing something like a curse, a generational curse in
Yeah.
his family. What was that guy's name? I forget his name.
Well,
And
the interview was actually with a woman. I had to have her voice disguised because
right, okay.
she was kind of that was back in like 2015,
Hmm.
and she was somewhat not widely known in my niche, but known enough where she just didn't want people to find her like in the life coaching type world because that's where she saw a lot of this weird, demonic stuff, for lack of a better word. And
Hmm.
her whole story was just fascinating to me. And I'm like, can I interview about this? And she said, yeah. I just said, look, I'll have your voice disguised. Unless somebody really personally knows you and knows your cadence of how you speak and all that. But even then, I think it's pretty hidden. No one's ever really been able to, only one person has figured out who she is, and it's because it's like a really good friend of hers. So,
Oh, okay.
there's no getting around that. But yeah, that was to me was just interesting because she had read the third novel called Demon Crossfire, where I go into more of that sort of thing. And she's like, holy, she's like, I experienced this. And I can tell you, Ben, I was experiencing this. And I read your book, and you had one of your characters do something that stops these visitations. And I did it, and it worked. And I was like, whoa, like I wasn't expecting that. But there it was. So I'm really glad. I should probably revisit that and talk to her again. But I thought that was very interesting.
That was a great, yeah, I enjoyed that interview. Fantastic interview. I've interviewed a few people like that on my own channel here. Nathaniel Gillis was one. We actually had the last interview. We were talking about Dark City, the movie Dark City from the 90s, and he comes from kind of like that way of thinking. Well, by the way, I read your email the other day when you were talking about Hellraiser, the movie Hellraiser from
Yeah.
1980s. That's a great movie. That's a fantastic movie. Have you what other movies from back the 90s, the 80s? Do you know Jacob's Ladder? Did you ever see that?
I saw it when I was very young, and I don't recall much about it. But I remember my dad rented it because on VHS. So now we're really dating ourselves here, and that's all I remember. I don't remember anything else about it though.
Yeah, that's a good movie. It's up there with Dark City and Hellraiser, for me, anyways. Ben, can you talk about what's the lost art of world building? What is that?
Well, world building is nothing new. I certainly didn't invent it or anything. I mean, I would say the modern, I don't want to say modern because he's been long deceased, but probably Tolkien was the master at it. But world building is when you build out a world, like it's your own universe, so to speak. You know, the movies, the Marvel movies, and all that kind of co-opted this as if they invented it all. All everything's a different world, different universe. But this is, this goes back. This stuff's been written about forever. I mean, one of my favorite TV shows, Fringe, went into this in a very intelligent, interesting way. I think with the parallel universes and all that. And so world building is just like you're sort of like the game designer, the way I look at it at least, and you kind of lay it all out and you make your own rules, right? You don't have to necessarily do things by when anyone else thinks. And so what the interesting thing about world building though, from a fiction point of view, the best lesson I ever learned about this, and people can easily look this up if they want, but another great world builder was C.S. Lewis. So like his Narnia books, he's most those, I don't know if those were his favorite books, but those are certainly like the best selling books, right?
Hmm.
And I remember reading this interview with him once, and this really simplified for me. So I'm passing this on to any would-be writers listening to this and who struggle at world building. They struggle with where to start. How do you wrap your head around this? If you read my 9 novels here, it looks like I had it all figured out from the beginning. Nothing could be further from the. I mean, I had ideas, but I didn't have it as figured out as it ends up being. Well, he said when he was writing the first Narnia book, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he didn't know anything. All he had was an image in his head of a faun or a satyr running through the forest with some presents in the snow, with like a lamppost or something. Like, it was just a bizarre image in his head. And he started writing. He goes, he had no idea who Aslan was. He didn't know there was a Cair Paravel castle. I don't think he knew there was a White Witch or anything. He just started with that image and it built one sort of brick at a time until he built this elaborate sort of castle house, whatever you want to call it, in his head, which became that world. And then, of course, he was able to espouse a lot of his other ideas and thoughts and theology and all of that into it. And it's a very fun thing to do. And it's just something you just got to get started with. Don't think you have to have it all figured out. I didn't know 95% of what it was going to turn out to be when I started. You have that idea and you just start running with it and you see what happens. And you know what? Maybe it turns out to be a bad idea and you're like, well, okay, then do something else. But you'll learn something from that first experience that you can now apply to the next experience, whether it's world building or anything else. That's been my experience.
Hmm. Could you explain what you mean by non-fiction day and fiction day? You compare it to working out and resting. You make that analogy.
Yeah, I see. This is kind of like an analogy from, I don't know how real this is for anyone else, but I write a lot of nonfiction, right? I write, you're on my email list, so I'm writing emails every day. I've lost count of how many business books, marketing related books I've written. I mean, I have so many books, I actually can't even remember them all. I mean, it's that much. It's well over, 10,000 pages, of just published words. It's all nonfiction. So I write a lot of nonfiction and then I write fiction. And I got to say, it's two different types of writing. Fiction is much harder. It's much more taxing, at least to me. It's not something I can just sit down and do every day. I have to kind of think about it. I have to plot it out in my mind a little bit. I literally carve out 6 to 8 weeks a year just to write fiction. And I work real hard on my other stuff so I can clear out my schedule and only work on fiction because that's just the way I work. And to me, fiction is like upper body workout. I do a lot of working out and everything. And, to me, doing the legs is like the hard part. I mean, it will absolutely, if you do legs right, I mean, you won't be able to walk barely up and down stairs. Like it's just very, very taxing. It's taxing on your nervous system. It's taxing on your legs, your body. It even strengthens and grows your upper body. It's very, very powerful exercising. You can't do it as often as your upper body, really. And so I look at fiction sort of as like doing legs days, like the gym bros like to call it. And when you write fiction, I defy anyone to do this and not find this to be true for them. If you write fiction, it actually makes your nonfiction better. And if you write a lot of nonfiction, it tends to make your fiction better. However, it is two different things altogether. Fiction is a very different animal than nonfiction, but do both of them, and I think it'll strengthen each. I have one of the things I've been studying for the last 10 years is kung fu, Wing Chun kung fu, and my Sifu is a master at I think three different types of fighting. So there's Sansu Kung Fu, Wing Chun Kung Fu, and I believe also at karate or something else. And he also knows a few other things like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and all that. And I asked him, like, how do you remember what you're doing? Like, do you have to consciously not do one when you're trying to teach this other? He goes, well, it's like math and geometry. He goes, you know all this stuff, but they're in their separate little compartments. They're really not the same. They're all very different. And he used that analogy of like one's algebra, one's geometry. You're probably not going to get those mixed up, but the stuff that you use in geometry might help with your algebra, and what you learn about algebra could help with your geometry. So I think of it in these terms with nonfiction and fiction as well.
Hmm. When you're talking about, for example, when I was reading the book, I thought the dialogue was very sharp. It was very it was each dialogue made sense in this book. Now, I know you like Tarantino, and sometimes when I'm watching a Tarantino movie, the dialogue is real, right? And it tends to like drift off into whatever the conversation, it doesn't really, it's not as rigid, right? The dialogue kind of like flows in a more natural way. Now, when I was reading Zombie Cop, the dialogue was very, very good, but it was more how can I say this? It was more tight. It was a tighter. To me, anyways, it felt more tight. Don't get me wrong, it was fantastic. The dialogue, it was funny, very funny dialogue. But who else do you think gets it right in terms of dialogue? And would you think that your own dialogue in Zombie Cop was like Tarantino's style of dialogue?
Well, I wouldn't compare myself to him, directly because, I mean, from what I understand of Tarantino, I've not written, I've read several of his screenplays actually. Is he treats dialogue almost like poetry. Like for him, it's like an art, right? He takes it to a degree and thinks about it to a degree I don't do. You call it lack of time or interest, or I just don't think of it that deeply. My whole thought is this. Um, every character, I don't know who first said this, who verbalized this first, but I don't remember who I heard this from, but it stuck with me. Every character in your story, whether it's a main character or just a bypassing person walking down the street who says one word of dialogue in the whole story, to that character, they are the main story. They are and they're, if you're going to think of them as real life people, they have a backstory, they have a point of view, there's depth there, just like everybody you know in your life. In their mind, they are the star of their own, and they are the star of their own story. Everybody is the star of their own life. And so I look at that. So even characters that only have like a line of dialogue, I want to make sure that line of dialogue does not sound like anybody else's dialogue anywhere else in the story, for sure. So they all have their own unique point of view. And sometimes that'll come out very obvious, and sometimes it's just in my head. You know, I'll tell you what, there are some filmmakers who do this very, very well. Tarantino's one of them. Like, if you ever read his interviews about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I mean, he takes it, he actually, the main character, Rick Dalton, right, that's played by Leonardo DiCaprio, um, that he was a star of a Western TV series called Bounty Law, playing Jake Cahill is the character. Well, Tarantino actually went and wrote 6 full-length TV episodes, scripts for that character, right? That nobody will ever see in the movie. They're not even referenced in the movie, other than maybe at the beginning where they show like little clips from his show or whatever. And he was saying that he goes, look, I have to know this world and these characters, like they're real people, like I have to know them at that level. The audience will never even know. I don't know how he put this, like 90% of what I know, but it doesn't matter. He goes, what matters is that I know. And he's right. It gives them a depth, those characters, a depth that's very interesting. He wrote a whole coffee book film anthology thing just on that character, Jake, or the Rick Dalton. And all the movies, he knew every cinematographer, every director of every episode. Like, he had this all worked out. Now we talk about world building. That's pretty amazing, I think. I mean, I just am too lazy to do all that.
He
But
wrote
that is one way.
six episodes, really?
Yeah, he wrote. Yeah, and I remember they were even talking about like airing them, like filming them and everything at the time, but it never happened. But
Wow.
that's how well he knew that world and his characters. Now, when I write my stuff, I just have that intention. This character is his own unique, everything has a backstory. James Cameron did this with Titanic. I don't know if people realize this or not, but he gave every extra. So I don't know how many dozens or hundreds of extras there were in that movie, but anyone on that boat, no matter how, they never even said anything. They may not even 2 seconds of film time. He gave them a backstory. A good actor would have made that their own somehow. They would have got into that character, especially like a method actor or something. And that's how I kind of look at it. And so, I would never compare myself to any, for good or bad. I don't think in those terms. Now, my publisher and friend Greg Perry, he said it reminded him of Tarantino, which was, definitely a compliment. But
Mhm.
I could be honest, I don't really take it, like, I don't think of it as poetry. I don't put that much work into it. I just want it to be a nice, natural flow. I
Mhm.
don't think it should be real, which is interesting, like authentic. There's the old comic book artist, Jack Kirby, right? Everybody knew who Jack Kirby was in the comic book world. And he said, and it's dumb to be authentic, because if you want to be in the real world, go be in the real world. Okay. But even people in the real world are not behaving authentically, right?
Mhm.
Nobody's really authentic. They just give you a facade. And so why wouldn't our characters be the same way? A lot of what a character says is really not what they're necessarily thinking. It could be they're thinking 2 or 3 thoughts ahead of whoever they're talking to, because they're in their own mind. They're not thinking about, even if you have 2 people having a discussion over dinner and you were to like eavesdrop, it's very rare for someone to really be an intent listener. Most people are already thinking of the next thing to say while the other person's talking. So I just kind of think in these terms.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. well, speaking of authenticity and being authentic, I know you speak in your emails a lot about ChatGPT. Well, not a lot, but you mention what's your word for a flab GPT?
Oh, I
What's
call it FAP GPT.
yeah, here you go. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
what is for example, when you're talking about ChatGPT or flab GPT, how dangerous or how inconsequential do you think it is
Well, I think
in
for right,
terms of being authentic?
well, I don't think there's anything authentic. I don't think there's anything intelligent. Like artificial intelligence is not even an accurate term. It's not intelligence. It's not by any definition of the word intelligent. It's not an autonomous thinking. It's not, I'm not even sure Skynet in the term here is technically that, but um, you know, my personal opinion is anyone who has anything to do with writing anything should stay away from anything like FAP GPT, Chat GPT, whatever it is. Anything where humanity is required. I'm not a big fan of using any of these so-called AIs. I'm just not. Now, does it have a use? Absolutely. Okay, my calculator has a use. Okay, it saves
Mhm.
me time and all that, but I'm not going to let it talk to the IRS for me. So,
Mhm.
that sort of thing. So, people can smell artificially generated text,
Yeah.
dialogue, all of it. I mean, people keep saying give it 2 years. They were saying that 2 years ago. What they don't understand is humanity has flaws built into it, right? It's kind of like this AI so-called art. And I say so-called because it's not really art. It's like a collage, I guess, but it's not really art. And it may look interesting, it may look so-called cool, but it's not really there. It's so weird. One of my favorite analogies for this is, for example, um, so this is something I don't know whose name was, but way back when Braveheart came out, the movie, or maybe it was shortly after Braveheart, there was this director, this guy who directed pornos. Okay. And he said the love scene, the marriage scene, when they're in the woods naked and all that, was real love. He goes, that looked like real love. He goes, what I do is not real as a porno director. He goes, it's not real. It's not love. It's just it was something like that. It's not real. But what Mel Gibson did was able to give it, make something that looked real and, for lack of a better word, authentic. And if you look at, for example, airbrushed models, right, on magazine covers, that's not really them. And you know it. And there's a natural human aversion to things like that. And it comes from the gut, and people can't necessarily verbalize it. I'm not even sure I can verbalize it. But it's something there when something is not actually real with humanity, right? You sense something's off. It doesn't mean it can't fool people. It can and it will, but there's going to be something in you that says there's just something off about this. You can even take this to psychopathic killers like Ted Bundy, right? Now he killed a lot of people in his day, and he would have to feign. He said this. He would pretend he had a broken arm or something so he could be more human,
Mhm.
more relatable, right? He would do that. Salespeople call it being unokay. Being unokay is actually very human. It's a very human thing, and people are comfortable with humanity. So if you have something that's not created with humanity, you're gonna sense something's off. It may look interesting. Oh wow, look at this cool graphic they created. Fine, but nobody's gonna sit there and stare at it on a wall for 3 hours and then pay $30,000 for it, right? Like real art. Now I know some art, you're like, why would anybody buy it? But then that is a whole other discussion about money laundering and stuff at art galleries, but we won't go into that. But my point is real, genuine humanity when you see it, when you hear it, when you take it in with any of your five senses, you know if it's real or not. And there's nothing real about, in my opinion, FAP GPT.
Yeah, you're 100% right. It can be very visually stimulating in a very superficial way, but it doesn't really get to the depths of what it is to be human. It doesn't get to the depths of, your soul, your spirit. I liked a lot of beat literature, Kerouac and Burroughs and these guys. And the thing about like especially Kerouac, the way he used to write, he was a very imperfect, it was all about, it wasn't about style, but it was just about the flow and being spontaneous and getting what is happening to you in the moment down on paper, regardless of making it perfect. And that really appealed to me in a strong way. You I think you like Bukowski. I like Bukowski as well. I think you said Women is your favorite novel. What other novel from Bukowski or any of those do you like, or what other story? He's got a great collection of stories. The most beautiful woman in town. I think the title is, and other stories. Um, did you ever read them?
Well, it's interesting that guy Robert Bruce I mentioned. He's a big
Mhm,
Bukowski fan. I had no idea who Bukowski was at the time, and he said my emails reminded him of Bukowski.
mhm,
So maybe that explains the first version of Zombie Cop. I don't know. Women it's definitely one of my favorite books, and I think because when I read it, I was a single guy trying to figure. I had just been divorced, and I was just trying to figure out women all over again, and it kind of helped me do that in a way. So I think that there's probably like if you read it, there's no real discernible plot in the book. It's just like
mhm,
one, like it's weird, but like you can't put it down, right? It's weird. It's one of those things. It's kind of like the painting in Seinfeld of Kramer, where the two
mhm.
old people are looking at it and they're saying he's a offensive, loathsome brute. Yet I can't look away. That's kind of how I see Bukowski. I haven't read his other books. I read Women. I started reading the Postman or
The
Post
post,
Office,
yeah,
whatever.
post office, yeah.
And I just didn't grab me the way Women did for probably because I read it at that time of my life. But
Hmm.
I can't say I've read a bunch of his other stuff.
Hmm. Post office. It began as a mistake. That very first line almost grabs you. It's like a great hook into the novel itself. In fact, some of his poetry, if anybody reminds me of a good email writer, it'd be Bukowski. Now, I'm not big into, I like poetry to a certain extent, but I'm not big into it. But Bukowski, I don't even know if you could call it poetry, but if anything could be more are adaptable to emails, it would be his poems. He just the way he starts sentences without a capital letter. Some sentences are broken. He doesn't use full stops sometimes. He just goes with it, and whatever comes out is it. What makes an authentic writer, Ben, in your opinion? Like, is it like if a writer is good or bad? I'm assuming it doesn't have anything to do with how good or bad he is actually as a writer, but what he's trying to, or what he or she is trying to express. How would you express a good, authentic writer?
Well, okay, so let me preface with this that I'm probably the worst judge of what good writing is. Like, if you look at the books I liked, and especially the movies I like, nobody's going to accuse me of being a good judge of what's good writing. So I'll just leave that out there. But um, I people will tell me that I'm a great writer sometimes, and it's very flattering. It doesn't happen all the time, but once in a while, Ben, you're a great writer. Okay, they read my emails or whatever, and I say technically I'm really not. I'm maybe a C plus level writer when it comes to the craft, right? But what I am is consistent, and what I am is I like to be a good communicator. I'm not trying to be a perfect communicator. I get bored by what people would call great writing. I really do. And it's not that I have anything against it. I don't think it's bad. I have a hard time reading this like perfect prose.
Hmm.
That's probably, I don't know. I'm into communication. Maybe because I'm a marketer and a copywriter. That's my thought is like, how can I get to from point A to point B with this thought with as little words and as little, as little obstacles as possible, right? But if you look at like great writing from great novels, it's usually the opposite. If you and there's by the way, this is not something I figured out. The late copywriter Gene Schwartz used to talk about this. He's like, look, copy is not the same as novel fiction writing. Because if you want to write great fiction, go ahead, but don't work that into your sales copy. Now, for better or worse, I'll be very honest here. For better or worse, okay, my novels read a lot like sales copy. Not that they're trying to sell you anything, but I'm trying to get to the point. One, like I am absolutely paranoid about boring people. As a copywriter, the worst thing you can be is boring. The worst, like if you lose the reader, that's it. They're done. Whatever you're selling is not going to be sold. So there's no room for expression of soul and all this other stuff, right? I'm just trying to get the ideas down. Now, I am a firm believer, copywriting, fiction writing, whatever. And this comes from the late, great Gary Halbert, who's one of the greatest copywriters who ever lived. Not a great fiction writer, but a great but his storytelling was as good as any fiction writer I've ever seen. If you everyone ever reads his ads,
Mhm.
but he said it's more what you say is far more important than how you say it. And his analogy was, imagine that you're in the most important business meeting of your life. You know, I don't remember exactly how he put this, but I'll probably exaggerating here. But the point I'll get across, you know, millions of dollars are on the line, intense negotiations. You've been building up to this meeting for months, right? Everything is on the line. This is the day. It happens or not. And suddenly the secretary pokes her head into the room and says, the hospital's on the line. Your wife's having triplets. Now, does it matter how she said it? No, the message was you're having triplets. Everything stops at that point. She didn't have to come in and do a big build up and her red flowing hair poke through the door. And I was, no, you're having triplets, man. You need to go to the hospital. That's it. That's the message, right? Now, to me, that's more important than how it was said. It didn't matter if she walked in and stuttered it, or if she came in and it took her, you know, she didn't know English very well or something, and, you know, it broke it. Like, it didn't matter. The message is what's important. So I look at it that way. What I'm saying, so I just want to be a great communicator. And a lot of the great communicators were not the best speakers, best orators, best writers. They just weren't, but they were great. So take Ronald Reagan, for example. Okay, Ronald Reagan was known as the great communicator, but this guy, I mean, it was one gaffe after another when he'd speak, right? It didn't matter. It was that unokayness, that imperfection, that humanity, I believe helps with communication. Now, you don't want to do it to the point where it becomes a distraction necessarily. But I'm just saying, like, to me, what you say is far, far more important than how you say it. When it comes to how to say things, though, I sound like a copywriter in all my novels, guaranteed. In fact, I have these books called, these are not fiction, but I call them my villains books. I have three of them.
Mhm.
I'm probably going to write a fourth one, which are just, you could call them self-help if you want. I don't know what you want to call what genre this would be. But basically, it's persuasion and influence and selling, tips and ideas learned from great villains from fiction and nonfiction alike. And I remember I have a chapter in the first one about the Joker. Okay. And 14 things the Joker did that make you very persuasive. And I isolated that and submitted it as an article to a website a few years ago. This website's no longer around. But at the time, it was had a lot of traffic going to it. I thought I could get some good leads from it. And so I submitted it. And there's nothing for sale in this chapter. But the guy who ran the site said, you know, it sounds like you're trying to sell me something. He goes, it sounds like sales copy. And, you know, he just kind of brushed it off. Now, the rest of the articles on his site were these long tomes and wall of text paragraphs of people just, you know, typing to hear themselves write, in my opinion. They didn't really get to the point. Mine got to the point. It was, so what's better writing? I don't know. I mean, I guess it's always in the eye of the beholder or the eye of the reader in this case, but that's my opinion of it.
Then again, even with a novel, even with your own novel, Zombie Cop, and I'm sure the other ones, you know, you you can apply copywriting formulas to it. Like, for example, you start off with a problem, you agitate the problem, and then there's a solution. And at the end, you know, it sorts itself out to a certain degree. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that is one of the foundations of great sales copy is what's called, I don't know who invented this, but I don't know if it was Gary Halbert or whoever, but they call it a star, a story, a solution, right? This is a proven structure for sales copy that goes back, I don't know how long, but forever, where you introduce somebody, the star, right, so, of the show, someone has a problem, right? They need to lose weight, whatever. You know, you could see this could be done in a long way. It could be done in 7 panels, like the old Charles Atlas comic book ads, right? And in fact, that's a perfect example. It was like 7 panels long. This thing ran for years and years and years. People kept buying the Charles Atlas course, which is about, you know, getting in shape and everything. And you have panel number one, the skinny guy's at the beach with his girlfriend, and this big guy like kicks sand in his face or something. and he can't do anything about it, and he's humiliated in front of his girl. There's your star. There, and now he's like in this tale of woe. Okay, he just got humiliated in front of his girl, goes home, orders the Charles Atlas course. Next thing you know, he's big and strong, and he goes and kicks the other guy's ass. Like that's it. There's star story solution. You have the star, which is whoever it's about, the ad is about. The story is their tale of woe. They find the solution, they find what's going to work, right? And now they go and they beat the villain. I mean, I'll tell you what, I just did this recently in today's email to my list. I don't know if you read it or not. It's very long, actually. It was like an 8-page email. Is about my business partner. Because right now this weekend we happen to be selling his options trading coaching, right? He's figured out a way of trading options. And I started with his story, which started with him being in like 8 or 9 out of 10 pain every day from jacking up his neck in pain, all these health problems he's had since. He almost died when we launched our Berserker Mill platform because of this. He had diabetes, he went blind, all these things happened. He's got heart problems now. I mean, you name it, this guy's like his body is just like mutilated and mangled. And, he had to figure out a low stress way of doing things because if he'd kept that up, he probably would have died, way too young. And so that's when he got into trading and he tried to trade crypto and he did fine, but that was really stressful because all the exchanges were being regulated and the taxes were kind of weird and nobody understood it. And you had to be on 24/7. You can't really rest. He'd be on vacation with his family and then suddenly something would happen with the crypto and he'd have to like stop and do it was really stressful. And then he went to swing trading and day trading and trading SPY and all these different things. And he wears a continuous glucose monitor, and that thing was always showing his blood sugar spiking off the chart every time something happened. He tried to do this thing where he subscribed to this guy's trade alerts, his billion-dollar hedge fund, and he realized that was really stressful too because he didn't understand how the guy was picking his stocks and what happens if this guy dies or something. And he'd have to literally tote his laptop to the bathroom sometimes because if he missed the alert, he'd be out thousands of dollars. Very stressful, right? And then then lo and behold, and it's a real story. That's the beauty of the stories, to make it real. He kind of stumbled into what he's doing now with trading options based on his background as a nuclear engineer and email automation guy and all that. And then he started teaching it to some people and make sure it wasn't just going to work for him, but work for others. And then lo and behold, now we have like a 400 client coaching of just rabid options traders who just love this, working 1 to 2 hours a week and very low stress, making 1% returns a week on average, all this stuff. And it's the same thing, star story solution.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it works. And I mean, that is how fiction works too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Frodo gets the ring, star of the story. He's getting chased by ring wraiths all the way to Rivendell, and then they decide they're going to send him to Mordor, and he takes his 8 companions, and then now they go through their thing until they get to the very end, and the solution happens when Gollum steals it and falls into the cracks of Mount Doom, and so it's all the same structure though.
Mm-hmm. You just mentioned there your friend, your business partner, and that and the whole transformation that he went through, and that that he lived through. What makes a good story, in your opinion? What I know we got a beginning, middle, and end, but apart from the like character transformation, or maybe that's exactly what makes a good story. But what do you think makes a good story?
Well, I think what makes a good
Sorry.
oh no, I was just going to say, like, no matter what the story is, right? I believe what makes a good story is conflict. You
Hmm.
got to have conflict, and there's a lot to this. Conflict equals engagement. Like if you want to write engaging stuff, write it with lots of conflict. This is the whole secret of soap operas, right? It's just one, conflict after. I mean, people who never watch that stuff are sitting there in the lobby of a hospital or something. They got an hour to kill. Suddenly they're watching General Hospital and they're hooked. And they're like, I don't watch this crap. How am I watching this crap? Because you're getting sucked into conflict and drama. Conflict and drama is really everything. I try to make all my characters conflict with each other and fight with each other and not agree with each other and do things that piss each other off. I mean, sometimes it's more obvious than others, but the more conflict, the more engagement. In fact, Marvel Comics, that Joe Quesada, the editor-in-chief back in the early 2000s of Marvel Comics, he wanted to get more publicity from Marvel. So he would sit there and they would start stuff, little battles with DC Comics. And he goes, conflict equals engagement. It works. I mean, that's the whole reality TV thing in a nutshell. Conflict,
Hmm.
conflict, conflict. And, if you don't have conflict, you don't really have a story. If you don't have a villain, there's no need for a hero.
Hmm. Yeah. You mentioned that in a previous interview that you concentrate a lot more on the villains rather than the good guys. Is this true?
It is absolutely true. In fact, every book is, except for the eighth one, for reasons that would be obvious to anyone who reads the eighth one, it's the villain is in the title, right?
Hmm.
Zombie cop, vampire apocalypse, demon crossfire, evil's child, werewolf bastard, hell's Frankenstein, Lucifer's favorite, serpent seed. These are the villains are in baked into the title. It's about the villains, right? Without the villains, I don't have a need for Azrael. To me, this is the interesting thing. The main character in these books is Azrael. He is the least interesting character to me. He really is. Like I'm trying to make him interesting, but I realize that the villains define the hero. The hero does not define the villains. The villains define the hero, in my opinion, at least. I'm not saying
Hmm.
it's never going to be the other way, but if you don't, there were okay. So when I was a young lad, okay, I think I was like in eighth, sixth grade or seventh grade. I think it was sixth grade. My grandparents at the time, so this is like 1986, right, or 87 or something. They had the Disney Channel, which was a big deal back then, by the way, to have the Disney Channel. Okay, that you didn't like that was a big deal. And so I didn't have the Disney Channel at home, but when I visited my grandparents, they had it. And I'd go up there and watch the Disney Channel the whole time. And I remember this show called The Wonderful World of Disney. And they had an episode about villains. It was just about the villains. It was hosted by the character, the man in the mirror character is kind of a creepy guy who hangs out in the mirror and tells, whatever. And he said, I'll never forget, um, he goes, without a villain, what do you got? Boredom. And it was all about villain. And when you really look at the old school Disney, I don't know what they're doing these days, but back in the day when Walt was running the show, those villains were, I mean, they were packaged for children, but they were pretty evil, horrifying characters. And does anybody really remember the prince or anything? No, do you remember the villains? Right? I mean, I'm not saying the other characters don't matter or anything, but at the end of the day, you walk away with the villain is one in your head. So my thought is the more nasty, mean, evil, powerful you can make the villain, the more impossible that villain is to take down. The more your character has to struggle and fight and figure things out how to beat this villain, the better. That's conflict. If it was
Hmm.
easy, there'd just be no story. There's no
Hmm.
reason to even read it. So that's my thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love that title, Werewolf Bastard. Such a great title.
Well, they have these books, most of them have double meanings too. So, like, in Werewolf Bastard is actually referring to two different characters. Zombie Cop, I would argue, is actually referring to two characters because I don't want to give plot away, but I'm just saying Azrael has an ability of dealing with him that kind of makes him, you know, I just leave it at that. And they all kind of have double meanings, and that's very intentional.
Mhm. So another question I wanted to ask you is about Clockwork Orange. How instrumental was Clockwork Orange in the structure of this book,
It
Zombie
was
Cop?
very. I've always been fascinated with Clockwork Orange. Um, I remember I didn't even know what it was until I don't know, I was in community college or something. I took this class where we read the books and then watched the movie. And one of the books that we read and then watched the movie was A Clockwork Orange. And first we watched the movie actually. And I was just like, wow, this movie is disturbing, violent, creepy, crazy, scary in its own way, horrifying. And I just couldn't stop watching it, man. I was like, this is so interesting to me, this movie. And then I read the book, and the book has a different ending. It actually has a seventh chapter to it.
Yeah. Hmm.
And the version Stanley Kubrick right only had the sixth chapter, and that's why it ends the way it does. I actually think the movie has a better, more realistic ending, but whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. But I like the structure of seven parts of seven chapters. I don't remember if it did seven parts, but I know it had seven chapters. And it's not that like, oh, there's some magical numerological reason for this. It just forces my brain to fit the story in and not go off on tangents and stuff, right? Like it's just a really good way. Like it was a way I structured all the books except the ninth book. All the first 8 books are 14 chapters. Each chapter has like 7 parts to it, and that forces my brain to get it all in without. Maybe it's the copywriter in me. I don't know, but I don't want to spend a lot of time going on tangents and side trips and all that. And it kept me focused, so that's why I did it. And then in the ninth book, I expanded it to 9. I think it was 19 chapters. I can't remember, but what it was. But maybe it's 19 chapters or 21 chapters, 18 chapters, whatever, with 9 parts each. And but it keeps me focused. That's the only reason I did it. It just keeps me focused and on track.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really well planned out, well structured. Last question I'm going to ask you, Ben. What writer do you think would have made a good email writer? What writer that you have maybe some author in the past that you like, or even even a contemporary author? Who do you think would make a would make a good email writer, and who doesn't write emails?
It's like an email copywriter, like what I do every day.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, I think I think Stephen King would make a good one because he's just I don't personally like the guy, and the older I get, the less I like him. But some of those older stories I think are great. In fact, I was just back and forth thinking about Salem's Lot. I think I must have read that book 4 or 5 times. It huge influence on me. And he does have a way of writing, especially his nonfiction, that's very engaging that I think would make great as he'd make a great email writer. In fact, his book on writing, I mean, if you took the biographical parts, each one could be its own daily email. Every part of that, I don't know if it's like 50 parts. I forgot how many chapters it is, but he does like parts, right? It's not like chapters. But I'd say any one of those would have made a great solo email to sell something if he wanted.
Hmm. He's got that other book as well that's hard to get. Bare Bones, is it? Something it's
I
called.
have that one. I have that. It's a bunch of interviews with him, and I also learned a lot from that. That's the thing, there's a lot to learn from even people you don't like and writers you don't like. In
Hmm.
fact, I think it's important to study at times, not all the time, but there are times to study people that you don't line up with ideologically or politically or religiously. Um, the reason why is because you can look at what they're doing objectively.
Hmm.
Like if you're a fan of somebody, everything they do is going to seem like they're genius, right? It doesn't matter what it is. Oh yeah, I mean you see it all the time, right? Does it
Hmm.
like we're having a big election coming up here in the States, right? Between
Hmm.
Kamala and Trump, and someone who's a fan of Kamala, she can do no wrong. Like she totally bungled the TV interview recently, and but her side thinks that she was like playing 5D chess. Trump's the
Hmm.
same way. People still think he's playing
Did you
4D
did you
chess from last time.
did you see did you listen to the speech that Trump gave at the dinner party when
Yeah,
he was
yeah, yeah.
I, he is a funny guy.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. He's a natural entertainer, right? At
Hmm.
the end of the day, he is an entertainer and a negotiator, and that's good for campaigning. But that's
Hmm.
my whole point, though. Like, there's a president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. I
Hmm.
don't like him worth a damn. Okay, I think he was just a terrible human, and I want nothing to do with him. But I can tell you, I've learned a very very interesting stuff about dealing with trolls by studying him. Trolls and reply guys and bad reviews. Um,
Hmm.
that I could look at objectively because I didn't like this guy, but I had to say, well, this is how he shut up his critics. This is very interesting, right? So
Hmm.
if you can find people you disagree with and look at their stuff objectively, you can learn a lot from them. Writing, whatever, communication, whatever it is. I don't know if this has to do with fiction very much, but like I said, I like the old Stephen King stuff. I don't really like Stephen King, but I can look at it objectively and say, that story or that story sure sucked me in. I was just
Hmm.
watching. In fact, this last week or a week or two ago, we were watching. This is the second time I saw it. The movie Doctor Sleep, which is like
Hmm.
a sequel to The Shining. I'm like, wow, this is really well done. I'm
Hmm.
like, this story is awesome. Like, especially if you like The Shining, it's like, wow, this is great. wow, I don't like Stephen King with a damn, but sure, he sure did a good job on that, and it almost makes you enjoy it more in a weird way because you don't like the person, you don't like the author, but you can appreciate the craft. And I think there's a lot to be said for that.
It's like what F. Scott Fitzgerald said. He said that the sign of a high intelligence is when you can hold two conflicting viewpoints in your mind and still function. So it's a sign of
Yeah.
so which is true. A lot of people just get, they have one way of looking at things, and whatever the other way is, they just, close the door to it. It's always good to know what the other side or the other person who you don't get on with or you don't particularly like, how he or she thinks. It's very useful.
Well, yeah, because it's all at the end of the day, they're communicating, right? And I don't like Bill Clinton, but to sit there and say he wasn't a great communicator when he was president, it would be just dumb. You can learn from these guys. I think it's important to learn from whoever you can about whatever. Doesn't mean you have to adopt that person's opinions, but to learn the craft of what they do. It'd be silly to just ignore it because you disagree with them.
Hmm. Hmm. Absolutely, 100%. Well, Ben, I just want to say it's been a great pleasure speaking to you. And can you tell people where they can find your stuff, where they can connect with you?
Yeah, you can, if you're into marketing and copywriting, you could find me at bensettle.com. If you're just into writing and fiction specifically, you could go to enochwars.com, ENOCH wars.com, and that'll get you into the mobile app that I have set up for that, where we talk a lot about what we were just talking about here, about writing. You can read more about the stories if you want, of course, but there's a lot in there besides just the fiction. I like to talk about the business side, the writing side, the thought process side. If you like this interview, you probably would enjoy the Enoch Wars app. It's free. You just have to download the free Learnistic app. There's nothing to pay for or anything like that. But that's enochwars.com.
Yeah, and that app, excuse me, I meant to ask you about that app. Learnistic is a fantastic app. I've never seen anything like it before in terms of the experience of reading a novel and the other things that are connected to that novel. It's like having how can I explain this? It's like having a little YouTube video or YouTube channel with all different videos and documents that are associated with it, but in a very different way, in a completely unique experience. I've never seen anybody do it like that before. So by all means, guys, look into that. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. Ben, can you hold on there a second? And I just want to thank you
Yeah.
again for your time, and you take care, Ben. Thanks so much.
Okay.